Situation: Spaniards and hostile natives occupy America's southern border. Mission: seize Florida in 1818. Execution: employ infantry and artillery as required. Administration: on orders from President Monroe. Command and control: General Andrew Jackson. Welcome to Conquerors. I'm Captain Dale Dye. To an officer, a sword or saber is more than just a weapon. It's a symbol of his office, his authority. And in 19th century America, no one knew that better than Andrew Jackson. To his enemies, he was the Napoleon of the woods, a tyrant in the making. To his friends, he was Old Hickory, a tower of strength when the nation needed it most. In 1818, Jackson fought a war against the Seminole Indians and conquered the former Spanish province of Florida. It was an outrageous act that raised fears about what Jackson might conquer next. Would it be more foreign territory or the White House? 21 November 1817. Seminole Indians ambush an open boat carrying 51 American citizens as it travels up the Apalachicola River toward Fort Scott in southern Georgia. The Indians butcher 46 people. Only 4 get away and 1 is taken captive. The bloodbath was not an isolated incident, but rather the latest round in a simmering conflict on America's border with Florida, then a Spanish colony.
Spain had very little control over Florida. They maintained very small garrisons, few troops, and very little influence over the area. And this meant that various Indian tribes could raid southern settlements of the United States and then flee to a sanctuary south of the border into Florida.
The United States protested to Spain about the problem time and time again. Two countries even signed treaties to officially try and stop the cross-border incursions. They were sabotaged, however, by British agents actively instigating the Indians. The brutal attack on the American boat changed U.S. military strategy. Instead of just trying to stop Indian border raids, a new mission emerged: seize Florida from Spain. Now, there was only one man in America capable of carrying out such an audacious mission, and that was Andrew Jackson. In 1817, he was the most popular man in America. A genuine military hero for his decisive victory over the British at the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. The fledgling nation could depend on Old Hickory.
Jackson got his nickname because hickory was the toughest wood in the forest, and it was used for axe handles and things like that. And his soldiers called him Old Hickory because they thought he was so tough and completely indestructible.
Indeed, he seemed to defy the laws of physics. After taking a bullet close to his heart in a pistol duel, Jackson shot his challenger dead. Too deep to be removed surgically, Jackson lived the remainder of his life with the bullet buried in his chest. During the War of 1812, Jackson had also earned a reputation as a fearless Indian fighter for defeating Britain's allies, the Creek Indians, on the southern frontier. They called Jackson Sharp Knife because he cut them deeply. He carved out 23 million acres of their land, including more than half of present-day Alabama and part of southern Georgia for the United States.
Jackson's personality was that he was ruthlessly violent against anyone whom he considered an inferior who tried to challenge him. And that would certainly include Indians whom he regarded as racially, morally, culturally inferior to white Americans.
But Jackson couldn't quickly subdue all the Indians on the southern frontier. These holdouts coalesced into the Seminole tribe and vowed to continue the fight.
The people we call Seminoles were essentially lower Creeks, with the addition of some members of other tribes who had been driven southward.
The Seminoles were known for being aggressive and brutal as the Americans were. The Seminoles would frequently cross the border between Florida and Georgia and attack American settlers. In fact, they claimed that much of this land belonged to them, that it had been improperly seized by Jackson at the Treaty of Fort Jackson that ended the Creek War that had occurred just a few years earlier. And they were not about to recognize the legitimacy of the American claim. So when they found Americans there, they attacked them. And then when the Americans counterattacked, they fled back into Florida where they knew they would be protected.
By the height of the raids, Jackson was a major general in the U.S. Army and commanded the 7th Military District, which included much of the South. To Jackson, the Seminole raids into areas under his jurisdiction called for an invasion of Florida. Of immediate concern to Old Hickory was the so-called Negro Fort, located 60 miles south of the Georgia-Florida border.
Slaves could escape from plantations in Georgia, head south to Negro Fort, where they were welcomed by the British. The British would do anything they could to foment unrest on the American frontier. Well, there they armed the runaway slaves and, in fact, dressed them in British red coats. And there were probably about 300 of these runaway slaves there, as well as a number of Indians who came into this fort for muskets, for gunpowder, before they perpetrated another raid on the American frontier.
In the spring of 1816, Jackson wrote to Spanish authorities in Florida demanding they dismantle the fort. But the Spaniards lacked the military might to do so. That left Jackson no choice. Soon after, he ordered General Edmund Gaines to destroy the slave stronghold.
General Gaines built Fort Scott just above the border with Florida as a staging area. He then began a march on Negro Fort, 60 miles to the south. Well, at the same time, the U.S. Navy sent gunboats from New Orleans to Negro Fort. The gunboats got there first, and they began a bombardment of the fort with hot shot. Some of this hot shot landed directly on the powder magazine of the fort. The explosion that followed destroyed the fort and killed nearly 300 of those in the fort.
Then General Gaines received a threat. Seminoles living in Foultown, an Indian village in southern Georgia, warned Gaines that any attempt to remove them would be met with lethal force. General Gaines accepted the challenge. On 12 November 1817, an expedition from Fort Scott reached Foultown and burned it to the ground while driving off its inhabitants. Nine days later, the Seminoles took their revenge on the boat carrying the American citizens. With that new round of violence, President Monroe ordered Jackson to take personal command of the operation. Old Hickory now believed that the only way to end the conflict with the Indians was to seize Florida outright from Spain. He assured President Monroe he could get the job done in 60 days if the president so desired.
President Monroe and everybody in his cabinet definitely wanted Florida. The question was how to get it. Since it was in Spanish hands, simply going there and seizing it might start a war with Spain. Moreover, since the British had once owned Florida and assumed a kind of sphere of influence over the area, then any kind of overt aggression against Florida might arouse the hostility of England. As a result, they wanted to find a way to get Florida without getting in trouble for it.
Looking to avoid trouble with foreign powers, Monroe concealed his intentions in deliberately vague orders to Jackson.
Jackson received a letter from Monroe in which he said, you have to go down there, and when you are there, you may find that there are other objectives for you to accomplish for your country. And I think that was a legitimate interpretation by Jackson that he was being asked to seize Florida.
Old Hickory rallied his troops and prepared to leave his beloved Tennessee home, the Hermitage. He was headed into battle once more. The First Seminole War was about to begin. January 1818. General Andrew Jackson departed his home in Nashville with a force of about 1,000 men and headed south to Florida to do battle with the Seminoles. The primary tool of conquest was the Springfield musket, the standard military long arm of the time. It fired a .69 caliber solid lead ball out to a range of about 100 yards, depending on wind and weather. The problem was, it took a soldier quite some time to load ball and powder, ram ball and powder, return the ramrod, and then prime the pan with powder, close the pan, go to full cock, and then fire. A Seminole Indian could fire 10 arrows in the same amount of time. So, the big equalizer was this bayonet. Jackson's ultimate mission was to conquer Florida, the Spanish province that provided Indians safe haven after they'd raided American settlements. It was an audacious goal, but one that Old Hickory was determined to achieve by any means necessary.
Andrew Jackson did not believe the laws of political gravity applied to him. He was his own man in his own way, and there was about him a native intelligence, an instinct. We call it street smarts today. He knew what he was and who he was. His problem was, and it was a serious problem, he had this ungovernable temper, and the slightest affront could set him off. I mean, when he goes to engage in the Seminole War, you have to remember that he's carrying bullets, sword scars from fights and duels in which he had engaged. He was a violent man.
Jackson's immediate destination was Fort Scott in southern Georgia near the Florida border. Jackson marched his army the 450-mile distance in just 46 days. Now that's a quick pace, despite heavy rains that turned roads into mud. They reached Fort Scott on 9 March. There, Jackson learned through spies that Seminoles and runaway slaves at St. Mark's, a Spanish settlement in Florida, were organizing attacks on the U.S. with the aid of British agents, including one Alexander Arbuthnot.
Alexander Arbuthnot was a Scot. He came from the Bahamas, and he had actually come to trade with the Indians. He wanted to help the Indians, and he was trading guns and ammunition for food and trying to help them any way he could. Jackson, of course, regarded him as a meddling villain. Arbuthnot said the guns and ammunition that he had given them was to help them improve their lives so that they could be better hunters, for example, not to kill Americans.
The Indians came to trust the 70-year-old Arbuthnot, and they heeded his counsel. He advised them to maintain peace and avoid any acts that might incite a war. But Jackson saw Arbuthnot as incitement itself.
Jackson believed that anybody who was doing business with Indians who were making war on the United States had to be inciting those Indians to make war on the United States, so he considered Arbuthnot to be not only an enemy agent, but an agent of the British. And Jackson hated the British, and therefore he considered Arbuthnot to be an enemy.
Jackson stopped just long enough at Fort Scott to feed his near-starving troops before resuming the march. His army now numbered 3,000, both regulars and volunteers, and an additional force of 2,000 Indian allies, including Creeks, whom he'd conquered during the War of 1812. With his men fed and fortified, Jackson was now ready to conquer Florida. On 15 March 1818, Jackson's birthday, the 51-year-old general reached the site of the former Negro fort. Jackson ordered it rebuilt and renamed Fort Gadsden after the engineering officer in charge of its reconstruction. It was now a United States Army fort. After marching 70 miles, Jackson reached the Spanish town of St. Mark's on 6 April and demanded the surrender of the lightly defended Spanish garrison on the grounds of self-defense.
Jackson believed so much in the righteousness of his own cause that he believed that anybody who resisted him must be aiding the Indians. Jackson was fighting the Indians. The Spanish were not aiding Jackson. Therefore, the Spanish were aiding the Indians. So that made it self-defense.
The Spanish commander at St. Mark's surrendered the fort to Andy Jackson without firing a shot. In fact, Andy Jackson sent him letters that suggested the two should be working together to control these renegade Indians who were raiding American settlements. And the Spanish commander, by treaties between Spain and the U.S., was supposed to be cooperating in this, but the Spanish commanders generally winked at the Indian raids.
The Americans occupied the fort, lowered the Spanish flag, and raised the Stars and Stripes. Jackson found St. Mark's empty of the hostile Seminoles he'd hoped to crush. He suspected that someone had tipped them off and they'd escaped before he got there. But Jackson did capture Alexander Arbuthnot, the noted Scotch villain, as he described the traitor, and he held him over for trial. 2 days after seizing St. Mark's, Jackson moved his army toward the town of Chief Billy Bowlegs, which was 100 miles to the east. Jackson believed the capture of that town would deal a major blow to Indian resistance to American settlement on the southern frontier. On the way to Chief Billy Bowlegs, Jackson's troops fought 2 brief skirmishes with hostiles. The Americans found the Seminoles to be spirited warriors who fought with small-bore rifles acquired through Spanish and British traders and, of course, their traditional bows and arrows.
The bows and arrows were still used because of their silence. They were a stealth instrument to kill people. The rifle, of course, you can hear it for miles through the woods because the sound bounces off all of the trees, travels for a while. But the bow and arrow still was a good choice in close combat. If you're within 20, 30 yards of somebody, you could still use the bow and arrow. And of course, you can get off 4 or 5 arrows before they can return a shot with the gunfire.
But despite their stealthy tactics, the Indians proved no match for Jackson. He extended his flank columns to squeeze the war parties, forcing them to retreat. Jackson pressed forward to Bowlegs town, destroying Indian villages as he advanced, an all too familiar scenario when the Army and Indians fought on the frontier.
What would typically happen is that the warriors would seize the opportunity to attack the Americans, which unfortunately left the towns undefended, and the Americans could go in, burn the town, kill all the cattle, capture the women and children, destroy the corn, and then at that point the warriors could be picked off at leisure. That's the way they had done it in Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina, and that's the way they did it in Florida.
In his wake, Jackson left a trail of destroyed Seminole villages. The general reached Bowlegs town on 16 April and occupied the nearly empty settlement. Once again, the Indians had been warned of his approach and escaped across the Suwannee River. A few days later, a dashing former British Marine officer, Robert Ambrister, arrived in town, unaware that Jackson had already occupied it.
Ambrister was a former British officer who had been fired from the service for some misbehavior, but he was essentially a soldier of fortune who wanted to go to the frontier and get involved kind of in a careerist situation, maybe make himself chief of something down there, no telling what. But Jackson thought that he too was a foreign agent.
Like Arbuthnot, his fellow Brit, Ambrister supported the Indians' cause, but by very different means. Instead of pursuing the peaceful approach advocated by Arbuthnot, Ambrister was known to have advised the Seminoles to war against the Americans as the only way to defend their rights and property. For such belligerence, Jackson also held Ambrister for trial.
Drop the sword.
There was still more evidence of British interference in frontier affairs. While occupying Bowlegs Town, a letter was found written by Arbuthnot which warned of Jackson's approach. Old Hickory now knew how the Indians had escaped it, and the knowledge confirmed his worst suspicions.
Essentially, Jackson was taking the position that the Seminoles could not be causing all this trouble by themselves. They had to be stirred up by outside agitators. The most plausible outside agitators were the British, whom Jackson thought were the enemies of the Americans up, down, and sideways, and had to be resisted at all cost.
In retaliation, Jackson torched Bowlegs Town. The Indians retreated further south into the swamps where they posed no immediate threat to American settlements across the border. For Jackson, the Seminole War was on hold, in his words, for the present. He returned to St. Mark's, blistering through the 100-mile distance in just 5 days. There, he convened a court to try Arbuthnot and Ambrister. But in Jackson's mind, they were already guilty. What he planned next would cause an international incident. Andrew Jackson's conquest of Florida depended not only on stopping Indian raids, but on ending foreign interference on the frontier. By bringing the two Seminole advocates, Arbuthnot and Ambrister, to trial, he intended to make an example of them to the world, whether or not he had the legal authority to do so.
As far as Andrew Jackson was concerned, he felt he did have that authority. And it's still, I think, a matter of debate. He need not have tried them. He should not have tried them. He should have referred them back to Washington because they were foreign nationals. They were British subjects. And the problem it would cause the administration to execute these men was enormous.
Jackson had no international legal precedence for such a trial, but nonetheless, as Jackson was wont to do, he charged ahead. In his own mind, and in fact in the minds of most Americans, especially those on the frontier, he was absolutely justified.
Jackson may have also felt justified for putting Arbuthnot and Ambrister on trial as a means to exact vengeance on the British. He had a long-standing hatred of them dating back to when the Redcoats captured him as a militia boy during the Revolutionary War.
There's a very famous story where a British officer demanded that Jackson clean his boots. Jackson said he was a prisoner of war and not a servant. He wouldn't do that sort of thing, so the British officer slashed him across the face with a saber, and Jackson carried that scar for the rest of his life. Jackson lost his brother. His father had been dead already, and then his mother went off to nurse some other relatives who were also captives of the British, and she died. So at the end of the American Revolution, Jackson had lost all of his family, and he could blame it on the British. In a child's mind, it's easy to understand that. So he added the normal hostility to the mother country to this kind of personal hatred.
Returning to St. Mark's after burning the Indian settlement of Bowlegs Town, Jackson handed over Arbuthnot and Ambrister to a special court of 13 officers, presided over by General Gaines. Court convened on 26 April. Arbuthnot was charged with acting as a spy and inciting the Indians to war. Ambrister was charged with aiding the enemy and assuming command of the Seminoles to wage war on the United States. Each man, without benefit of legal counsel, defended himself against the charges. After several witnesses testified, the court deliberated.
The trial is a farce. It's a travesty. 13 officers are going to try him, all of them right under Andrew Jackson's thumb. He wants to kill him. He wants to execute him. Both of them during that trial plead for mercy. And in my judgment, they're entitled to mercy. I don't see how you send them to prison, much less execute them, but Jackson had it in his mind that he was going to make an example of them. He was going to send a message to those Brits.
The court returned its verdicts on 28 April. It found both men guilty and sentenced them to death. The next day, the sentences were carried out. Arbuthnot was hanged. Ambrister was sentenced to be shot, but a member of the court requested a reconsideration, and the court changed the punishment to 50 lashes and confinement with a ball and chain for a year. Jackson, however, believed Ambrister was an outlaw who deserved to be shot. He approved the original punishment.
Jackson overturns his own court. He kills them both.
Hey! Hey! Fire!
One more time, he couldn't control his passion. And it's sad. It's a sad moment in our history.
The capture, conviction, and execution of Arbuthnot and Ambrister caused an international furor, especially in Great Britain, where many considered Jackson's action an act of war.
There was a lot of angry talk in the British newspapers. The idea that His Majesty's subjects could be wantonly put to death by an American commander who was outside of his own country was outrageous to British public opinion. But by the time Parliament got around to debating the issue, time had passed, and the British realized that they didn't, just like the Americans didn't want to go to war with Britain right then, the British didn't want to go to war with America right then either, and therefore they were willing to let the matter die.
For his part, Jackson made good on his word to end foreign interference on the frontier. In his mind, that's all that mattered, even if it did reveal the ruthless side of the hickory-hard will that drove him.
The execution of Ambrister and Arbuthnot showed Jackson's capacity for scapegoating. They showed his capacity for acting in disregard of the international implications, and it showed his determination to inflict violence on anybody that crossed his path.
The Seminole Indians came to recognize that Andrew Jackson was a very vengeful man. He executed Indian chiefs when he captured them, and that he would even execute English nationals, men they thought who had authority from the crown. And some of them said, all he had to do was look at us and we died. For them, Andrew Jackson was no one to mess with.
Jackson didn't even witness the executions of the men he put to death. While Arbuthnot dangled from a noose and Ambrister bled, the general simply resumed his campaign to run the British, the Seminoles, and the Spanish out of Florida. he marched toward Pensacola, the center of Spanish power in Florida. Conquest was at hand, but so was more controversy. In Andrew Jackson's mind, the only way to make the southern frontier truly safe from Indian aggression was to seize Florida outright from Spain. An outrageous move for anyone else, but for Jackson, it would be business as usual.
In his own mind, as it was always the case, there was self-justification. It's in the interest of my country, and when it comes to the interest of my country, my love of country puts my actions above any orders, any directives, any authority, even that of the President of the United States.
On 24 May 1818, Old Hickory and his army arrived in Pensacola, the center of Spanish power in the province. Jackson easily captured the lightly defended town. The Spanish governor, Colonel Jose Massat, and 300 men retreated to Fort Barrancas, situated on a bluff overlooking Pensacola Bay. Here, Massat made his last stand. Jackson demanded Massat's surrender, but the Spaniard refused, and with that, Jackson prepared to fire on the fort with a 9-pounder and 5 8-inch howitzer batteries. The term 9-pounder referred to the weight of solid shot that Jackson's artillery could throw, and not to the field artillery piece itself. Jackson's artillery could fire a 9-pound ball like this out to a range of about a half a mile, and it was usually against fortifications. This little ball could do a lot of big damage, and Jackson had absolutely no problem with using his artillery in the conquest of Florida.
Under cover of night, he moved some artillerists up to a hill 300 yards west of us, another to a hill 700 yards north, and positioned the men pretty much right under the Spanish guns. In the morning, he demanded surrender again. They refused, fired cannons to try to dislodge his artillerists, and once Jackson realized they were not going to turn the fort over, he opened fire.
A spirited fight followed. Massat, realizing that he was outnumbered 10-1, quickly surrendered. With a minimal show of force, Jackson had effectively conquered Florida. He issued a proclamation justifying his action again on the grounds of self-defense and announced the establishment of a provisional government. On 2 June 1818, Jackson notified President Monroe that with the destruction of many Indian villages, the execution of foreign agitators, and the seizures of St. Mark's, Fort Gadsden, and Pensacola, the Seminole War was over. Jackson had accomplished his mission. But the campaign had taken its toll on the 51-year-old general.
At the end of the Seminole War, Andrew Jackson wrote home to his wife and said he was absolutely exhausted, that he had lost weight, that he had a terrible cough. I don't doubt that he had a case of dysentery, but he was very weak, and he was very anxious to get home so that he could recover.
It was only Jackson's poor health that stopped him from taking his mission to a new extreme, Cuba. Having struck fear into the hearts of the Spaniards, Jackson was confident he could conquer that Spanish territory as well. On 28 June, Jackson returned home to the Hermitage in Nashville, receiving a hero's welcome for making the frontier safe for settlement. But in Spain, Jackson was attacked as a villain whose bold seizure of Florida was painfully reminiscent of another military tyrant who craved conquest on his own terms.
The Spanish called him the Napoleon of the woods, because as Napoleon had done in Europe, become this military tyrant who was a law unto himself, well, now Jackson was similarly kind of a buckskin-clad frontier version of Napoleon.
Jackson's exploits in Florida, from the executions of the 2 British subjects to the forced surrender of Spanish forts, had caused an international incident. England and Spain now had grounds for declaring war on the United States. The Spanish foreign minister protested fiercely, demanding at least an apology, if not a repudiation of Jackson's actions. The crisis put President Monroe in a delicate position.
After Jackson took Florida, the Monroe administration publicly stated that he had far overstepped his bounds and gone well beyond his orders. Of course, that was the plausible deniability that the Monroe administration needed. They wanted Florida, and they knew if they gave Andrew Jackson some latitude in his orders, he would take it. But Monroe did not want to explicitly state that this was the aim of his administration, so therefore they had cover for themselves.
The crisis worsened as many in Washington also attacked Jackson for his Napoleonic conduct. Congressmen clamored to censure him. To Jackson, those were fighting words. He rallied himself from the Hermitage and headed into battle once more, this time to conquer Washington and reclaim his honor. Now, here's Jackson's tips for conquerors. 1. Use psyops to intimidate your enemy. 2. When you've got the edge, go for it, even if it exceeds orders. And 3. Be ruthless in the extreme. Andrew Jackson's bold seizure of Florida caused a calamity at home and abroad. Spain demanded restitution of their province, while many in Washington, from Congress to the cabinet, demanded Jackson be punished for exceeding his orders and usurping their powers. President Monroe turned to the one man in his administration who openly supported Jackson, and who also happened to be the nation's most skilled diplomat to negotiate a resolution to the mounting crisis.
It was only the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who argued that what the Indians did in attacking our frontier was something that should have been controlled by the Spanish, but that the Spanish obviously couldn't do it. They didn't have the military strength. Therefore, every time in the future that the Seminoles attacked our frontier, we would be obliged to go back into Florida. That indeed the action of Jackson was justified, and that the only way the Spanish could maintain their honor and prevent any further incidents was to cede Florida to the United States.
To legally end the crisis, the U.S. offered to buy Florida from Spain. While Adams met with Spanish officials to negotiate the deal, Jackson fumed at the Hermitage. The administration's dilemma perplexed him. He'd carried out what he thought were the president's real aims in Florida, so why all the criticism instead of the gratitude he thought he deserved? Now, Jackson was prone to taking conflicts personally, so he concluded that political opponents who saw him as an American Napoleon must be fomenting the crisis and tarnishing the luster of his victory. And for once, Jackson's paranoia may have been justified.
There were many figures in Congress who thought, hey, you know, this guy can end up overthrowing the Republic and making himself the dictator of America. Henry Clay, for example, who was Speaker of the House, began to warn about the military chieftain taking over the government. So there were people in Congress and in the cabinet who debated about whether Jackson should be censured for having killed these British subjects and seized the Spanish forts and all the rest.
Still recovering from lingering ailments sustained in the Florida campaign, Jackson arrived in Washington on 23 January 1819 as the House debated whether to censure him. The arguments against Jackson were strong, but not as persuasive as the will of the people.
Members of Congress were feeling that heat. And you know, when you challenge the hero who's made their country safe from the Indians and from the British, and now from the Spanish, I mean, the people are on his side. And so he was wearing the armor of democracy.
On 8 February, Congress voted down 4 resolutions condemning Jackson. Feeling fully vindicated, Old Hickory celebrated.
Jackson carried the day by his assertion of basically what he thought of as the destiny of the American people to take this territory by hook or by crook. And when John Quincy Adams concluded a treaty with the Spanish minister to, in effect, purchase Florida, nobody felt like it was worth going over the details about how it had been accomplished.
John Quincy Adams had great political savvy and also great experience. He was able to soothe all these ruffled feathers. And in fact, behind the scenes, at meetings of Monroe's cabinet, John Quincy Adams staunchly and vehemently defended the actions of Andy Jackson, because those were the actions that everybody really privately wanted.
Jackson's popularity skyrocketed. The following week, he was literally mobbed by hordes of adoring citizens while visiting New York City and Philadelphia. On 22 February 1819, the Adams-Onis Treaty was signed. Spain ceded the territory formerly known as East and West Florida to the United States at a cost of $5 million in assumed claims against Spain. It was a minuscule sum, equal to about $130 million in current values, the approximate value of a single high-end Florida property today. For Jackson, who always linked his personal rise to that of the nation, the acquisition of Florida was a boon to his political prospects.
Although Jackson's actions in Florida may have caused international furor for a time that quickly died, the American people loved him for it and endorsed his actions. So now Jackson was not only the hero of the Creek War, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, but now he had acquired all of this territory for the United States, and Jackson was now the leading candidate in a run for the presidency.
While Jackson ascended, the Seminoles retreated. They moved further south, deeper into the Florida peninsula to regroup. They resolved to stay on their land. They would fight a second war against the United States that raged from 1835 to 1842, this time resisting President Jackson's attempts to remove them. The Seminoles did not surrender then or ever.
We really don't see him as a conqueror, at least not in Florida, because if he had conquered us, I wouldn't be here giving this interview today. Neither would the Seminole tribe of Florida exist, but we do. We're here, we're still thriving.
Andrew Jackson's conquest of Florida remains not only controversial, but relevant.
How do we go about protecting our independence, especially when it is jeopardized by enemies who are ready to invade this country one way or another and change our form of government? Andrew Jackson, as a conqueror, as a military figure, was the best the country had to offer. And so they looked upon him as their protector, as their savior. And today, I think, we look to our army and the generals who command the army to do what is necessary to safeguard our independence and our liberty. And that was what Jackson did back in 1818, and the American people recognized it and were grateful.
In 1821, Andrew Jackson served as the first territorial governor of Florida, but he had higher aspirations. In 1824, he lost a bitter presidential election to his one-time supporter, John Quincy Adams. Jackson ran again in 1828 and was elected, but he seems to have preferred the role of conqueror to chief executive. While in the White House, he demanded to be addressed not as Mr. President, but as General Jackson. I'm Captain Dale Dye. Thanks for watching.